Late one evening, a weary cowboy walked into the small-town diner, dust on his boots, silence in his eyes. She poured his coffee, served his meal, and offered a kind smile no one else noticed. He thanked her softly and left without a word, but when she cleared the table, her hands froze. Beneath the napkin lay a bank check, signed with his name. The tired cowboy she'd served wasn't just passing through. He was a wealthy man who'd just changed her life forever. The rain came down like nails on tin, hammering the cracked asphalt of Route 9 where the desert turned soft with mud and memory. Millersville Diner sat alone at the edge of the valley, its yellow sign flickering against the storm like a candle that refused to die. Inside, the air smelled of burnt coffee and old grease, warm and familiar in a way that made strangers feel less afraid. Clara Hensley wiped down the counter for the third time that hour, her hands moving without thought, her eyes on the window where lightning split the sky in two. She didn't expect anyone to come, not in weather like this. But then the door opened. A gust of wind slammed it against the frame, and rain blew in hard enough to scatter napkins across the floor. The man who stumbled through was soaked to the bone, his coat heavy with water, his boots leaving dark prints on the linoleum. He stood there for a moment, dripping, silent, like something the storm had coughed up and didn't want back. His hat was pulled low, shadow covering most of his face, but Clara could see his jaw. Tight, tired, the kind of tired that came from running too long without rest. She didn't move right away, just watched him. Watched the way his shoulders sagged, the way his hands hung at his sides like they'd forgotten what to hold. He didn't look dangerous. He looked broken. "Counter or booth?" she asked, her voice cutting through the rain noise. He lifted his head just enough for her to see his eyes, pale, distant, full of something she recognized but couldn't name. "Counter's fine," he said quietly. His voice was rough, like gravel scraped across wood. Not mean, just used up. Clara grabbed a towel from under the register and tossed it across the counter. He caught it without looking, pressed it against his face, and let out a slow breath that sounded like relief and regret all at once. She poured him coffee before he asked, black and strong, steam rising between them like a question she hadn't decided to answer yet. He wrapped both hands around the cup and stared into it. Outside, the storm howled. Inside, the diner was still. Clara leaned against the counter, arms crossed, studying him the way she studied everyone who came through that door. Millersville wasn't the kind of place people ended up by accident. It was too far off the main roads, too small to matter, too quiet to hide in for long. Drifters came through sometimes, men with nowhere to go and nothing to say, but they usually left before sunrise. This one, though, he didn't look like he had anywhere left to run. "You got a name?" she asked. He didn't answer right away, just kept staring into that coffee like it held something he'd lost. "Eli," he said finally. "Eli Ward." She nodded. Didn't press. Names didn't mean much out here anyway. "You need food?" "Just the coffee." "You sure?" "Kitchen's still open." He glanced up at her then, and for a second something flickered across his face. Gratitude maybe, or shame. Hard to tell. "I'm sure," he said softly. Clara shrugged and refilled his cup without asking. The rain kept falling, harder now, drumming against the roof like it was trying to beat its way inside. The lights flickered once, twice, then held. She could hear the hum of the freezer in the back, the low crackle of the old radio on the shelf, playing static more than music. It was the kind of quiet that made people nervous if they weren't used to it, but Clara was. She'd lived in this valley all her life, worked in this diner since she was 16. Quiet didn't scare her. People did. Eli drank his coffee slow, like he was trying to make it last. His hands trembled just slightly around the cup, not from cold but from something deeper. Exhaustion, maybe, or fear. Clara had seen enough scared men to know the difference between someone running from the law and someone running from themselves. Eli looked like both. "Storm's not letting up," she said after a while, glancing toward the window where rain blurred the world into streaks of gray and black. "No," he agreed. "Roads will be flooded by morning. I know." She waited for him to say more. He didn't. Clara sighed and grabbed a rag, wiping down the counter again even though it didn't need it. It gave her something to do, something other than stare at the stranger, who looked like he'd walked through hell and back just to sit in her diner and drink bad coffee. "There's a motel down the road," she offered. "Miller's Inn. It's not much, but it's dry." Eli shook his head. "I'll be fine." "You planning to sleep in your truck?" "Don't have a truck." Clara raised an eyebrow. You walked here?" He didn't answer. Just took another sip of coffee, his eyes fixed on the counter like he was afraid to look anywhere else. She let it go. It wasn't her business. Out here, nobody's story was anybody's business, unless they chose to share it. And Eli Ward didn't look like he was ready to share anything. The rain kept falling. Time moved slow. An hour passed, maybe two. The clock on the wall ticked loud enough to count heartbeats. Clara restocked napkins, wiped down the tables, checked the pie case even though nobody had ordered pie in days. Eli stayed at the counter, nursing his third cup of coffee, silent as stone. Every now and then, she caught him glancing toward the door, like he was waiting for something. Or someone. "You in trouble?" she asked suddenly. He looked up, startled, like he'd forgotten she was there. "No," he said, but his voice cracked on the word, just enough to make it sound like a lie. Clara crossed her arms. "I'm not calling the sheriff if that's what you're worried about." Eli's jaw tightened. "I didn't ask you to. I know. I'm just saying." He stared at her for a long moment, and Clara stared back. She wasn't afraid of him, didn't know why exactly. Maybe it was the way he held himself, like he was trying to make himself smaller, less noticeable. Or maybe it was the way he looked at her, not with hunger or anger, but with something quieter, something that felt like shame. "I'm not a bad man," he said quietly. Clara nodded. "Okay. I mean it. I believe you." He blinked, surprised, like he hadn't expected her to say that. Like nobody had said that to him in a long time. The storm outside roared louder, thunder shaking the walls, and the lights flickered again. This time, they went out. The diner plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow of the emergency lantern Clara kept behind the counter. She grabbed it and set it on the bar between them, the light casting long shadows across Eli's face. "Power'll be out till morning," she said. "Happens every time it rains like this." Eli nodded but said nothing. Clara leaned against the counter, arms folded, watching him in the dim light. He looked older now, worn down by more than just the rain. There were lines around his eyes, deep and carved, the kind that came from years of squinting into dust and wind and regret. His hands were rough, scarred, the hands of someone who'd worked hard for little and lost more. "You can stay here tonight," she said. Eli's head snapped up. "What? It's not safe to be out there. Roads are washed out. You'll end up in a ditch. I can't. I'm not asking you to pay. Just stay till the storm passes." He stared at her, confused, like he didn't understand why she'd offer. Clara didn't either, not really. She just knew what it felt like to be alone in a storm, and she wouldn't wish that on anyone. "There's a booth in the back," she continued. "It's not comfortable, but it's dry. I'll lock the front door. You'll be fine." Eli opened his mouth like he wanted to argue, but no words came out. He just nodded, slow and careful, like he was afraid the offer might disappear if he moved too fast. "Thank you," he said, and his voice was so quiet Clara almost didn't hear it. She shrugged. "Don't mention it." She locked the front door, flipped the closed sign, and grabbed a blanket from the storage closet. It was old and scratched, but it was clean. She tossed it across the booth in the back corner, the one farthest from the windows, and gestured for Eli to take it. He did, slowly, like he wasn't sure he deserved it. Clara turned off the lantern and headed for the door that led to her small apartment above the diner. She paused at the threshold, glancing back at him one last time. "If you need anything," she said, "just knock." Eli nodded. She left him there in the dark, listening to the rain. Upstairs, Clara sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the ceiling. She didn't know why she'd let him stay, didn't know why she trusted him when she didn't trust much of anyone anymore. Maybe it was the way he looked at her, like she was the first person in a long time who hadn't looked away. Or maybe it was the way he trembled when he held that coffee cup, like he was afraid it might slip through his fingers. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, Clara wondered if she'd just made a mistake. But when morning came, gray and cold, and she descended the stairs to find Eli already awake, folding the blanket neatly on the booth, his boots lined up by the door to dry, she realized something. He hadn't left, and neither had the storm. Clara stood at the bottom of the stairs watching him. He didn't notice her at first. He was standing by the window, looking out at the flooded street, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. The rain had softened to a drizzle, but the sky was still heavy, dark clouds rolling slow and low like something waiting to break. "Coffee's on the stove," she said. Eli turned, startled again. "I can pay for it. I didn't ask you to." Still. Clara walked past him and poured 2 cups, sliding one across the counter in his direction. He took it but didn't drink right away, just held it, steam curling between them like a thread too thin to hold anything. "Roads are flooded," she said. "Sheriff's probably got barriers up by now. Nobody's getting in or out today." Eli nodded. "I figured. You got somewhere you need to be?" He shook his head. "No." Clara studied him. "Then I guess you're stuck here." He didn't respond. Just sipped his coffee, slow and careful, like he was afraid to take too much. The diner was quiet, empty. The rain tapped soft against the glass, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Clara turned on the radio, let the static fill the silence. She didn't mind the quiet, but she knew some people couldn't handle it. Eli didn't seem to mind either. "You always this nice to strangers?" he asked suddenly. Clara glanced at him. "You asking if I regret it? Maybe?" She thought about it. "No, why not? Because you haven't given me a reason to." Eli looked down at his coffee, and for a moment, Clara thought she saw something crack in his expression, something soft and fragile that he'd been holding too tight for too long. "I'm not used to that," he said quietly. "Used to what?" "People not expecting the worst." Clara leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "Maybe you've been around the wrong people." Eli smiled, just barely, and it was the saddest smile Clara had ever seen. Outside, the rain kept falling, and inside, between 2 strangers who'd found shelter in the same storm, something quiet began to shift. Not trust, not yet, but the possibility of it. And in a place like Millersville, where the wind carried more ghosts than promises, that was enough. But when dawn broke over the drenched highway, Clara realized the man hadn't left, and neither had the storm. The rain didn't stop. 3 days it fell, steady and relentless, turning the valley roads into rivers of mud and memory. The highway flooded first, then the access road, then the gravel path that led to Miller's Inn. Water pooled in the ditches, crept across the parking lot, and by the 3rd morning Millersville was an island, cut off from the rest of the county by walls of brown water that stretched as far as anyone could see. Clara stood at the diner window watching the world drown. Behind her, Eli was mopping the floor. She hadn't asked him to. He'd just picked up the mop that morning, quiet as always, and started working. The floodwater had seeped under the door overnight, leaving dark stains across the linoleum, and Eli moved slow and steady, pushing the water back toward the threshold like he was trying to hold the storm at bay with nothing but will and worn hands. "You don't have to do that," Clara said without turning around. "I know," Eli replied, but he kept mopping. Clara watched his reflection in the glass. He moved like a man used to work, shoulders bent, hands sure. There was a rhythm to it, something almost meditative. She wondered how long he'd been drifting, how long he'd been alone. "Coffee's ready," she said. Eli stopped, leaned the mop against the wall, and wiped his hands on his jeans. He didn't say thank you. He never did. But he nodded, and that was close enough. They sat at the counter, the 2 of them, steam rising from their cups, the rain drumming soft against the roof. The diner was empty, had been for days. Nobody could get in, and nobody could get out. Clara had stopped turning on the open sign. There was no point. "You think it'll stop soon?" Eli asked. Clara shrugged. "Hard to say. Last time it rained like this, the roads were out for a week." Eli stared into his coffee. "A week? You in a hurry?" He hesitated. "No." Clara didn't believe him, but she didn't push. She'd learned that about Eli over the past 3 days. He only spoke when the silence got too heavy, and even then, his words came slow and careful, like he was afraid they might betray him. "There's a leak in the back," he said suddenly, "above the storage room. I can fix it if you've got a ladder and some tar." Clara looked at him. "You know how to patch a roof?" "I know how to do a lot of things." She didn't ask what kind of things, just nodded and pointed toward the closet. "Ladder's in there. Tar's in the shed out back. Keys are on the hook." Eli stood, finished his coffee in one long swallow, and headed for the door. "Eli," Clara called after him. He stopped, glanced back. "Why are you doing this?" He didn't answer right away, just looked at her with those pale, tired eyes, and for a moment, Clara thought he might actually tell her the truth. But then he shook his head, slow and careful, and walked outside into the rain. By midday, the leak was fixed. By evening, the light above the register was working again. Clara hadn't even mentioned it was broken, but Eli had noticed. He always noticed. She found him in the back corner of the diner, tools spread out on the table, the bulb flickering to life under his hands. He didn't look up when she approached, just kept working, his fingers moving with a kind of precision that surprised her. "You're handy," she said. Eli glanced at her, then back at the light. "My father taught me. Said a man who can't fix things can't be trusted." Clara leaned against the booth. "He sounds like a hard man." He was. Eli tightened the last screw and flipped the switch. The light held steady, bright and clean, but he wasn't wrong. Clara watched him gather the tools, his movements slow and deliberate, like he was trying to stretch the moment out as long as he could. She wondered if he was afraid of sitting still, afraid of what might catch up to him if he stopped moving. "You want dinner?" she asked. Eli looked up, surprised. "You don't have to. I'm cooking anyway, might as well make extra." He hesitated, then nodded. "Okay." They ate at the counter, side by side, plates of meatloaf and mashed potatoes between them. Clara had cooked too much, she always did, but Eli didn't complain. He ate slow, savoring every bite like he hadn't had a real meal in weeks. Maybe he hadn't. "Where'd you learn to cook like this?" he asked. Clara smiled faintly. "My mother. She ran this place before me, said the secret to good food was making people feel like they were eating at home. Does it work? Sometimes." Eli took another bite, chewed thoughtfully. "It works." Clara felt something warm settle in her chest, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Pride, maybe. Or just the simple satisfaction of feeding someone who needed it. "What about you?" she asked. "Where are you from?" Eli's fork paused halfway to his mouth. He set it down carefully, stared at his plate. "Nowhere worth talking about. Everyone's from somewhere, not me." Clara waited, but he didn't say more. Just picked up his fork again and kept eating, his jaw tight, his eyes distant. She let it go. She was getting good at that, knowing when to push and when to let the silence do the work. Outside, the rain finally began to ease. By the time they finished eating, the storm had softened to a drizzle, and the sky was starting to clear. Clara walked to the window and looked out at the flooded street, the water reflecting the last light of the day like broken glass. "Looks like it's finally letting up," she said. Eli came to stand beside her, hands in his pockets, shoulders hunched. "Yeah." Clara glanced at him. "You'll be able to leave soon. Roads should dry out in a day or two." Eli nodded but didn't say anything. Clara turned back to the window. "You don't have to, though." "What? Leave?" "You don't have to leave." Eli looked at her, confused. "Why would you want me to stay?" Clara shrugged. "You've been helpful, and it's nice having someone around." "I'm a stranger." "Not anymore." Eli stared at her, and for a moment Clara thought she saw something shift in his eyes. Something soft and breakable, like a door opening just a crack. But then he looked away, shook his head, and the moment passed. "You don't know me," he said quietly. "I know you fixed my roof," Clara replied. "I know you mopped my floors. I know you didn't steal anything or cause trouble. That's more than I can say for most people." Eli opened his mouth like he wanted to argue, but no words came out. He just stood there, silent and uncertain, like he didn't know what to do with kindness when it was offered freely. "Think about it," Clara said, and walked back toward the kitchen, leaving him alone by the window. The next morning, Eli was still there. Clara found him outside, repairing the fence that ran along the side of the diner. The wood was old and rotted in places, splintered by years of wind and neglect. Eli worked slow and steady, replacing boards, hammering nails, his shirt soaked with sweat even though the air was cool. Clara brought him water. He drank it without stopping, handed the glass back, and went back to work. "You don't have to fix everything," she said. "I know. Then why are you—" Eli paused, hammer in hand, and looked at her. "Because you let me stay." Clara didn't know what to say to that, so she just nodded and left him to his work. By the end of the week, the roads had dried and the town began to stir again. Trucks rolled through, kicking up dust. The mail coach arrived late, carrying newspapers and letters and a stack of wanted posters that the sheriff would tack up outside his office. People started coming back to the diner. Old Earl, who always ordered eggs and bacon and complained about the coffee. Betty Cross, who ran the general store and liked to gossip about everyone in the valley. Tom Miller, who owned the inn and drank too much whiskey and never tipped. They all noticed Eli. "Who's the new guy?" Earl asked, jerking his chin toward the kitchen where Eli was washing dishes. "A friend," Clara said. "Friend?" Betty leaned in, eyes wide. "Since when do you have friends?" Clara ignored her and refilled Earl's coffee. "He got a name?" Tom asked, squinting toward the back. "Eli." "Eli what?" "Just Eli," Tom grunted. "Don't look like he's from around here." "He's not." "Where's he from, then?" Clara set the coffee pot down hard enough to rattle the counter. "Does it matter?" Tom raised his hands in surrender. "Just asking." But Clara could see it in their eyes. The suspicion, the curiosity, the judgment that came easy in small towns where everyone knew everyone, and strangers were never just passing through. They looked at Eli like he was a puzzle they couldn't solve, and that made them nervous. By the end of the day, the whispers had started. "Heard he showed up in the storm," Betty said to Earl at the counter. "Heard he's got no truck, no horse, nothing," Earl replied. "What kind of man travels with nothing? The kind that's running." Clara heard it all. She always did. But she didn't respond. Just kept pouring coffee, kept taking orders, kept moving like the words didn't touch her. Eli heard it too. She saw the way his shoulders tensed when Tom asked where he was from. Saw the way his hands shook just slightly when Betty stared at him a little too long. He kept his head down, worked quietly, and didn't speak unless spoken to. That night, after the diner closed, Clara found him sitting outside on the steps, staring at the horizon where the sun was sinking slow and red. "You okay?" she asked. Eli didn't look at her. "They don't trust me. They don't trust anyone. They trust you." Clara sat down beside him, close enough to feel the warmth of his shoulder. "That's because I've been here my whole life. You're new. Give them time." "I don't have time." Clara looked at him. "What does that mean?" Eli didn't answer. Just kept staring at the horizon, his jaw tight, his hands clenched in his lap. "Eli," Clara said softly, "what are you running from?" He closed his eyes, and for a moment Clara thought he might finally tell her. But then he stood, brushed the dust off his jeans, and walked back inside without a word. Clara stayed on the steps, watching the sun disappear, wondering how long it would take before the past caught up to him, and whether she'd still be standing beside him when it did. Days turned into something softer. The town kept whispering, but Clara stopped listening. Eli kept working, and she stopped asking why. They fell into a rhythm, quiet, steady, like two people learning to breathe in the same room without colliding. Mornings, Eli would wake before dawn and start the coffee. Clara would come downstairs to find the diner already warm, the lights on, the world outside still dark. They'd drink in silence, watching the sun rise over the valley, the light spreading slow and gold across the dust. Afternoons, Eli would fix whatever needed fixing. A broken stool, a loose hinge, the radio that crackled too much. He worked with his hands and Clara worked with hers, and together they kept the diner running like it hadn't run in years. Evenings they'd sit at the counter and eat whatever Clara cooked, and sometimes, if the silence felt right, Eli would talk. Not about where he came from or what he'd done, but about small things. The way the light looked on the highway, the sound of rain on metal, the way coffee tasted better when someone else made it. Clara listened, always listened, and slowly, piece by piece, she began to see him, not as a stranger but as a man trying to find his way back to something he'd lost. But the town kept watching, and the mail coach kept coming, and somewhere, folded in a stack of posters that hadn't yet reached Millersville, was a face that looked an awful lot like Eli Ward. One evening, after the last customer had left, Clara locked the door and turned to find Eli standing by the window, staring out at the darkening road. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked quietly. Clara walked over, stood beside him. "Sometimes. Why don't you?" "Because this is home, and home isn't something you leave just because it's hard." Eli nodded slowly. "What if home doesn't want you anymore?" Clara looked at him, at the sadness carved deep into his face, and she understood then, truly understood, that Eli Ward wasn't running from something. He was running towards something he'd never had. "Then you build a new one," she said softly. Eli turned to her, and for the first time since he'd walked through that door, he smiled. Not much, just a flicker, but it was real. "You think that's possible?" he asked. Clara nodded. "I do." Outside, the sky was clear. The stars scattered like salt across black cloth. The storm was gone. The roads were dry. Eli could leave any time he wanted, but he didn't, and Clara didn't ask him to. Because somewhere between the rain and the silence, between the coffee and the quiet work, They'd both found something neither of them had expected. Not peace, not yet, but the beginning of it. And in a place like Millersville, where the wind carried more ghosts than promises, that was everything. But just as the sun returned to the valley, a shadow from Eli's past began its slow ride toward Millersville. Summer came to the valley like a slow exhale. The rains dried up, leaving the earth cracked and golden, and the mornings turned soft with heat that shimmered across the highway in waves. The diner opened its windows for the first time in weeks, letting the warm wind roll through, carrying the smell of dust and wildflowers, and something that felt almost like hope. Eli was still there. Clara stopped questioning it somewhere around the third week, stopped wondering when he'd leave, stopped waiting for the inevitable morning when she'd come downstairs and find him gone. He'd become part of the rhythm of the place, the sound of his boots on the floor, the quiet hum of his voice when he counted change at the register, the way he moved through the kitchen like he'd been there all his life. She taught him how to run the register first. "It's not complicated," she said, standing beside him at the counter, her shoulder brushing his. "You punch in the order, take the money, give the change. Don't overthink it." Eli nodded, his hands hovering over the keys like he was afraid to press them. "Go on," Clara urged. "Earl's waiting." Earl grunted from his booth, folding his newspaper with exaggerated impatience. "Take your time, son, I got all day." Eli glanced at Clara, and she gave him a small nod. He pressed the keys, slow and careful, and the register dinged open. He counted out the change, handed it to Earl, and stepped back like he'd just defused a bomb. Earl pocketed the coins and squinted at him. "You new to this?" "Yes, sir." "Well, you're doing fine. Better than Clara, anyway. She always shortchanges me." Clara rolled her eyes. "I've never shortchanged you in my life, Earl. Could have fooled me." Eli smiled, just barely, and Clara felt something warm settle in her chest. He was learning, slowly, but he was learning. By the end of the week, Eli could work the register without hesitation. By the end of the month, he was taking orders, pouring coffee, wiping down tables like he'd been born to it. The regulars got used to him, stopped asking where he came from, started calling him by name. "Morning, Eli." "Coffee, Eli." "How's it going, Eli?" He never said much in return, just nodded, offered a quiet morning or fine, thanks, and kept moving. But Clara could see the way his shoulders relaxed when people stopped staring, the way his hands stopped shaking when someone smiled at him instead of looking away. He was starting to belong, and that terrified him. Clara saw it in the way he still glanced toward the door every time it opened, the way he flinched when someone mentioned the sheriff, the way he went quiet whenever the mail coach rolled through town, like he was waiting for something to arrive that he didn't want to face. "You ever gonna tell me what you're afraid of?" Clara asked one evening, after the diner had closed and they were sitting at the counter splitting a piece of pie. Eli stared at his plate. "I'm not afraid." "Liar." He looked up, startled, and Clara held his gaze. "You jump every time someone walks in," she said. "You watch the road like it's gonna swallow you whole. You're afraid of something, Eli. You don't have to tell me what. But don't pretend it's not there." Eli set his fork down, slow and careful. "What if I told you I did something I can't take back?" "Did you hurt someone?" "No." "Did you kill someone?" "No." Clara leaned back, arms crossed. "Then I don't care what you did." Eli blinked. "You don't care?" "Not unless it's gonna hurt someone here. And so far all you've done is help." Eli stared at her, and Clara could see the conflict in his eyes, the part of him that wanted to believe her, and the part that didn't think he deserved to. "I'm not a good man, Clara. You keep saying that. But I haven't seen any proof. You don't know what I've done. Then tell me." Eli shook his head, looked away. "I can't." Clara sighed, picked up her fork, and took another bite of pie. "Fine. Keep your secrets. But don't expect me to stop trusting you just because you don't trust yourself." Eli didn't respond, just sat there, silent and small, like a man who'd forgotten how to stand up straight. But the next morning, he was smiling again. Clara taught him how to measure the pies by feel. "You don't need a scale," she said, standing beside him at the counter, flour dusting her hands. "You just press down with your fingers. If it springs back, it's ready. If it sinks, it needs more time." Eli pressed down, tentative, and the dough sank under his touch. "More time," Clara said. He nodded, kneaded the dough again, his hands moving slow and uncertain. Clara watched him, saw the concentration on his face, the way his brow furrowed like he was trying to solve a puzzle that didn't have an answer. "You're thinking too hard," she said. "I don't want to mess it up." "It's just pie, Eli. You can't mess up pie. I've messed up worse things." Clara's hand stilled. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the weight he carried in the slump of his shoulders, the tightness of his jaw. He wasn't talking about pie. "Hey," she said softly. He looked up. "You're doing fine." Eli held her gaze for a long moment, and then, slowly, he nodded, pressed the dough again. This time, it sprang back. "There," Clara said, smiling. "See, you've got it." Eli smiled too, small, real. And for a moment the weight seemed to lift. The days fell into a rhythm that felt almost normal. Mornings they'd prep the kitchen together, Clara cutting vegetables, Eli brewing coffee, the radio playing low in the background. Sometimes they'd talk. Mostly they didn't. The silence was comfortable now, familiar, like an old blanket that didn't need to be pretty to be warm. Afternoons the diner would fill with the usual crowd. Earl and his newspaper, Betty and her gossip, Tom and his whiskey breath. Eli moved through it all with quiet efficiency, pouring coffee, delivering plates, clearing tables. He didn't talk much, but he listened, and people liked that about him, made them feel heard. "Your boy's got a good head on his shoulders," Earl said to Clara one day, nodding toward Eli. Clara glanced over at him, saw him helping Betty carry her groceries to her truck. "He's not my boy. Could have fooled me." Clara didn't respond, just refilled Earl's coffee and walked away before he could see her smile. Evenings, after the diner closed, Eli would fix things, the fence, the gate, the old radio that crackled too much. He'd found a toolbox in the storage room and claimed it as his own, and now he moved through the diner like a man on a mission, tightening screws, replacing hinges, patching holes that Clara hadn't even noticed were there. "You don't have to do all this," she said one night, watching him repair a broken shelf. "I know," Eli replied, not looking up. "Then why do you—" He paused, screwdriver in hand, and looked at her. "Because I like it here." Clara felt something tighten in her chest. "You do?" "Yeah." He went back to the shelf. "I haven't liked anywhere in a long time." Clara didn't know what to say to that, so she just stood there, watching him work, and felt the space between them shrink just a little more. One evening, Eli fixed her old radio. Clara had given up on it years ago. The thing was ancient, held together with tape and hope, and it spent more time crackling than playing music. But Eli took it apart piece by piece, cleaned the connections, replaced a wire, and when he turned it on, it played clear and strong. A song drifted through the diner. Slow, sweet, something about longing and distance, and the way home never looked the same once you left it. Eli stood there, hands in his pockets, listening. Clara walked over, stood beside him. "I forgot this thing could sound like that." "It's a good radio," Eli said. "Just needed someone to pay attention to it." Clara looked at him. "You're good at that." "At what?" "Paying attention to things other people forget about." Eli's jaw tightened and he looked away. "I'm not good at much else. I don't believe that. You should." Clara reached out, touched his arm gently. "Eli, look at me." He did, slowly, reluctantly. "You've done more for this place in a few weeks than anyone's done in years," she said. "You've helped me. You've helped the people who come through here. You've made this place feel less lonely. That's not nothing." Eli stared at her, and Clara saw something crack in his expression, something soft and fragile and desperate. "What if it's not enough?" he whispered. "Enough for what?" "To make up for what I've done." Clara held his gaze. "I don't know what you've done, Eli, but I know who you are now, and that's the only thing that matters to me." Eli's breath hitched, and for a moment Clara thought he might cry, but he didn't, just nodded, swallowed hard, and turned back to the radio. The song kept playing, and outside, the sun sank low, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber, like the world itself was trying to forget the storm that had come before. The weeks turned soft and golden. Summer deepened, and the days stretched long and warm. The diner hummed with life, laughter and conversation and the clatter of plates. Eli became part of it all, no longer the stranger but the quiet man who poured your coffee and remembered how you liked it. The town stopped whispering, stopped watching, started accepting. Clara caught herself smiling more. She'd wake up in the mornings and hear Eli humming downstairs, some tune she didn't recognize, and she'd lie there for a moment, just listening, feeling something she hadn't felt in years. Contentment. One afternoon, Eli came in from outside carrying a basket of wildflowers. "Found these growing by the fence," he said, setting them on the counter. "Thought they might look nice in here." Clara stared at them. Bright yellow blooms, delicate and wild, still dusted with pollen. "You picked flowers?" she asked, surprised. Eli shrugged, suddenly awkward. "Is that weird?" "No, it's—" Clara smiled. "It's nice." She found a jar, filled it with water, and set the flowers in the window. They caught the light, glowing soft and golden, and Clara realized the diner hadn't had flowers in it since her mother died. "Thank you," she said quietly. Eli nodded, his cheeks flushed, and went back to work. That night, after the diner closed, they sat outside on the steps, watching the stars come out one by one. The air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of sage and dust, and the world felt vast and quiet in a way that made Clara's chest ache. "You ever think about the future?" Eli asked suddenly. Clara glanced at him. "Sometimes. Why?" "I don't know. I haven't thought about it in a long time. Didn't think I had one. And now?" Eli looked at her, and in the dim light, his eyes were soft and unguarded. "Now I think maybe I do." Clara's breath caught. "Eli, I know I can't stay forever," he said quickly. "I know that. But, for now, this feels like enough." Clara wanted to tell him he could stay as long as he wanted to tell him she didn't want him to leave. But the words stuck in her throat, tangled up with fear and hope and something she wasn't ready to name. So she just nodded. "For now is good." Eli smiled, small and sad, and they sat in silence, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead. And for a little while longer, the world felt kind. But peace in the West never lasts long. Somewhere beyond the valley, in a town neither of them had heard of, a mail coach was being loaded with letters and parcels and a stack of wanted posters that had just come in from the county seat. The sheriff's office had ordered them. Standard procedure. Faces and names and crimes printed in black and white circulated from town to town like seeds carried on the wind. One of those faces belonged to a man named Eli Ward, and by autumn the posters would reach Millersville. But for now, on that warm summer night, with the stars above and the smell of wildflowers drifting through the open window, Clara and Eli sat side by side and let themselves believe that tomorrow might be just as kind as today. But peace in the West never lasts long, and by autumn, the town began to remember the price of kindness. Autumn arrived like a held breath. The air turned crisp and cool, carrying the scent of dry leaves and distant smoke. The wildflowers by the fence withered and turned brown, their petals scattering across the dirt like forgotten promises. The mornings came later, the sun rising slow and pale, and the evenings fell faster, swallowing the valley in shadow before supper was done. Clara felt the shift in her bones. Something was coming. She didn't know what, but she felt it in the way the wind moved, restless and searching. In the way the regulars lingered longer over their coffee, talking in low voices about strangers passing through, about trouble brewing in the counties to the east. In the way Eli had started glancing toward the door again, his shoulders tight, his smile vanishing like smoke. "You okay?" she asked him one morning, watching him stare out the window at the empty highway. He didn't answer right away, just kept looking, his jaw clenched, his hands gripping the edge of the counter. "Eli?" "Yeah," he said finally, "I'm fine." But Clara knew he wasn't. The mail coach arrived on a Tuesday. Clara was refilling napkin dispensers when she heard the familiar rattle of wheels on gravel, the snort of horses pulling up outside the post office across the street. She glanced out the window and saw old Joe climbing down from the driver's seat, a leather satchel slung over his shoulder, his face weathered and tired from the long ride. Nothing unusual. The coach came every week, regular as clockwork. But this time, when Joe walked into the sheriff's office, he was carrying something extra. A thick roll of paper, bound with string. Clara watched through the window as Sheriff Dawson took it, unrolled it on his desk, and started thumbing through the pages. Wanted posters. Clara's stomach tightened. She told herself it didn't matter, told herself those posters came every month, and they never had anything to do with Millersville. Just faces from other towns, other lives, crimes that belonged to people who'd never set foot in this valley. But when she turned around, Eli was gone. She found him in the storage room, sitting on an overturned crate, his head in his hands. "Eli." He didn't look up. Clara crossed the room, crouched down in front of him. "Talk to me." "I can't. You can. You've just been too afraid to try. Eli lifted his head and Clara saw the fear in his eyes, raw and desperate like a man standing at the edge of a cliff. It's going to catch up to me, he whispered. I thought if I stayed quiet, if I worked hard, if I just disappeared into this place, maybe it wouldn't find me, but it always does. It always. Eli, what did you do? He closed his eyes, his breath shaking. I took something that wasn't mine. Clara's heart sank. What did you take? Money. A lot of it. The word hung between them, heavy and cold. Clara sat back on her heels, trying to process it. You robbed someone. A bank. But it wasn't. Eli's voice cracked. It wasn't for me. Then who was it for? Eli opened his eyes, looked at her with something that might have been shame or might have been defiance. Men who'd been cheated. Miners. They worked a claim for months, broke their backs pulling copper out of the ground, and the bank refused to pay them, said the claim was invalid, said they didn't have the paperwork. But they did. I saw it. The bank just didn't want to pay. Clara stared at him. So you took it. I took what they were owed, and I rode 3 counties to return it. Eli's hands clenched into fists. But the bank didn't see it that way. They called it robbery. Put a price on my head. $5,000. Clara felt the air leave her lungs. $5,000. That kind of money could change a life out here. Could buy land, livestock, a future. People had killed for less. How long ago? She asked quietly. 8 months. And you've been running ever since? Eli nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. I thought I could outrun it. Thought if I kept moving, kept my head down, maybe they'd forget. But they don't forget. Not when there's money involved. Clara stood slowly, her mind racing. 8 months. He'd been carrying this for 8 months, and he'd never said a word. Never asked for help. Never trusted anyone enough to share the weight. Until now. Does anyone here know? She asked. No. I didn't use my real name when I... Eli stopped, looked up at her. Wait. Clara, what are you... I'm asking if anyone in this town knows your face from before. No, I've never been here before. But if that poster, then we have time. Eli stood, grabbed her arm gently. Clara, you can't get involved in this. I'm already involved. No, you're not. You didn't know. You can still... What? Pretend I never heard this? Turn you in? Clara pulled her arm free, her voice hardening. Is that what you think I'd do? Eli's face twisted with pain. I think you should do what's right. What's right is keeping you safe. Clara, no. She stepped closer, held his gaze. You listen to me, Eli Ward. I don't care what that poster says. I don't care what the bank says. You did something good. You tried to help people who couldn't help themselves. That doesn't make you a criminal. That makes you a good man who got punished for doing the right thing. Eli shook his head, his voice barely a whisper. You don't understand. If they find me here, they'll come for me, and anyone who helped me. I don't care. Clara, please. I said I don't care. Eli stared at her, his eyes wide and disbelieving, and Clara saw the moment something broke inside him, not in a bad way, but in the way a dam breaks when the water's been held back too long. He turned away, his shoulders shaking, and Clara realized he was crying. She'd never seen him cry before. She stepped forward, wrapped her arms around him from behind, and held him while he fell apart. I've got you, she whispered. I've got you. And for a long time, neither of them moved. The evening came slow and heavy. Clara opened the diner like always, served the usual customers, smiled and poured coffee, and acted like nothing had changed. But inside, her mind was spinning. She kept glancing across the street at the sheriff's office, watching for movement, waiting for the moment when Dawson would step outside with that poster in his hand. Eli stayed in the back, out of sight. Clara brought him coffee, told him to stay put, told him she'd handle it. He didn't argue, just sat there, pale and quiet, like a man waiting for the gallows. By 7 o'clock, the diner was nearly empty, just Earl in his usual booth, nursing his 3rd cup of coffee, and Betty at the counter, chattering about nothing. Clara was wiping down tables when the door opened. Sheriff Dawson walked in. Clara's heart stopped. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with a thick mustache and eyes that didn't miss much. He wore his badge like a weight he'd carried so long he'd forgotten it was there. His boots clicked against the floor, slow and deliberate, and when he reached the counter, he took off his hat and set it down gently. Evening, Clara. Evening, Sheriff. Clara kept her voice steady. Coffee, please? She poured him a cup, her hands remarkably steady despite the storm raging inside her chest. Dawson took a sip, nodded his approval, and then reached into his coat pocket. Clara's breath caught. He pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn at the edges, and spread it flat on the counter. A wanted poster. Clara forced herself to look, and there he was, Eli. The photograph was old, grainy, but it was him. Same eyes, same jawline, same quiet sadness etched into every line of his face. The words above his picture were stark and unforgiving. Wanted for bank robbery. Eli Franklin Ward. Reward, $5,000. Clara's stomach twisted, but she kept her face blank. You seen this man? Dawson asked. Clara looked at the poster, then at the sheriff, and lied without hesitation. No. Dawson studied her. You sure? Take a good look. Clara looked again, slower this time, like she was really considering it. I don't think so. Why? He come through here? Maybe. Got a report he was spotted 2 counties over, heading west. Thought he might have passed through Millersville. Clara shrugged. Lots of people pass through. I can't remember every face. Dawson nodded slowly, but his eyes didn't leave hers. This one's different. $5,000 is a lot of money, Clara. Someone in this town sees him. They might want to collect. Well, I haven't seen him. What about your helper? The guy who's been working here? Clara's heart slammed against her ribs. What about him? What's his name? Eli. Eli what? Just Eli. He didn't give a last name. Dawson's eyes narrowed. Where's he from? Didn't ask. When'd he show up? Few months ago, during the storm. And you just let him stay? Didn't ask any questions? Clara met his gaze, steady and unflinching. He needed help. I gave it to him. That's what people do, Sheriff. Dawson stared at her for a long moment, and Clara could feel the weight of his suspicion pressing down on her like a stone. But she didn't look away, didn't flinch. Finally, Dawson picked up the poster, folded it, and tucked it back into his coat. If you see him, he said quietly, you let me know. Of course. Dawson drained his coffee, set the cup down, and put his hat back on. He walked toward the door, spurs clinking, and Clara thought maybe, just maybe, she'd gotten away with it. But then he stopped, turned back. Clara. Yes, that helper of yours. Where is he now? Clara's mouth went dry. In the back, washing dishes. Dawson nodded. Mind if I have a word with him? Why? Just want to ask him a few questions. See if he's seen anything. Clara's mind raced. She could refuse. Could tell Dawson to come back with a warrant, but that would only make him more suspicious. And if he came back with deputies, Eli wouldn't have a chance. Sure, Clara said, her voice calm. I'll get him. She walked toward the kitchen, her legs shaking, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. She pushed through the door and found Eli standing by the sink, his hands gripping the edge of the counter, his face pale as death. He'd heard everything. Clara, don't, she whispered. Don't say anything. Just be yourself. Answer his questions. Don't lie unless you have to. He's going to recognize me. Maybe, maybe not. That picture's old. You've changed. Not enough. Clara grabbed his face, forced him to look at her. Eli, listen to me. You are not a criminal. You are a good man who made a hard choice. You hold on to that. You hear me? Eli's eyes filled with tears, but he nodded. Clara let him go, stepped back, and pushed open the door. Sheriff? He's coming. Eli walked out slowly, wiping his hands on a towel. He didn't look at the sheriff, didn't look at Clara, just stood there, shoulders hunched, waiting. Dawson looked him up and down, slow and deliberate. The diner went silent. Earl stopped reading his paper. Betty stopped talking. Even the radio seemed to hold its breath. Dawson stepped closer. What's your name, son? Eli. Eli what? Eli hesitated. Ward. The silence stretched, thin and fragile. Dawson's hand moved toward his coat pocket. Clara's heart stopped, and then Dawson pulled out the poster, unfolded it, and held it up beside Eli's face. The room froze. Clara watched as Dawson's eyes moved back and forth, poster to face, face to poster, and she saw the exact moment recognition clicked into place. Well, Dawson said softly. I'll be damned. Eli closed his eyes. Clara stepped forward. Sheriff, step back, Clara. He didn't. I said step back. Dawson pulled out his handcuffs, the metal clinking loud in the stillness. Eli Franklin Ward, you're under arrest for the robbery of First National Bank of Copper Ridge. Sheriff, please. Clara's voice broke. Clara, don't make this harder than it has to be. Eli finally looked up, and when he met Clara's eyes, she saw something that broke her heart. Acceptance. It's okay, he said quietly. It's okay. No, it's not, Clara. His voice was gentle, calm. Let him do his job. Dawson cuffed him, the metal biting into Eli's wrists, and Clara felt something inside her shatter. She wanted to scream, wanted to fight, wanted to throw herself between them and refuse to move. But Eli shook his head just slightly, and she understood. This was always going to happen. Dawson led him toward the door, one hand on Eli's shoulder, and Clara followed, her vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall. At the door, Eli stopped, turned back. Thank you, he said softly. For everything. Clara couldn't speak, could only watch as Dawson pushed him outside, into the cool autumn air, under a sky heavy with clouds that promised rain. Earl stood up, peered out the window. Well, that was him all along. Betty's hand flew to her mouth. Oh my lord. Clara, did you know? Clara didn't answer, just stood there staring at the empty doorway, listening to the sound of Eli's boots fading into the distance. Outside, thunder rumbled. The storm was coming back, and this time, Clara didn't think it would ever leave. She stood at the window and watched as Dawson walked Eli across the street, past the post office, past the general store, toward the small jail that sat at the edge of town. People came out of their houses, drawn by the commotion, whispering and pointing. Clara saw their faces, some curious, some satisfied, some hungry with the thought of $5,000 they'd never see. Eli kept his head down, didn't look at any of them, and Clara thought she'd never seen a man look so alone. The jail door closed behind him with a heavy clang that echoed across the valley, and Clara stood there trembling, her hands pressed against the cold glass, and made a choice. She wasn't going to let him face this alone. Not now, not ever. But before the next sunrise, Clara would make a choice that would cost her everything she'd built. The diner stayed open that night, but nobody came. Clara stood behind the counter, the lights burning bright, the coffee pot full, waiting for customers who wouldn't walk through that door. She could feel their judgment from across the street, seeping through the walls like cold air. By morning, everyone in Millersville would know that she'd harbored a fugitive, that she'd lied to the sheriff, that she'd chosen a criminal over her own people. She didn't care. At midnight, she locked the door, turned off the lights, and climbed the stairs to her apartment. She didn't sleep, just sat by the window, staring at the jail across the way, watching the single lantern burning in the window of Eli's cell. When dawn broke gray and cold, Clara was already dressed. She packed a basket, bread, cheese, the last piece of apple pie, a thermos of coffee, and walked across the street. The town was still asleep, the sky heavy with clouds that hadn't yet decided whether to rain or just linger. Her boots crunched on the gravel, too loud in the silence, and when she reached the jail, she hesitated. Then she knocked. Sheriff Dawson opened the door, still in yesterday's clothes, his eyes red from lack of sleep. Clara, I brought food. Dawson looked at the basket, then at her face. For him? Yes. You shouldn't be here. I know. Dawson sighed, stepped aside. 5 minutes. That's all I can give you. Clara walked past him into the dim interior of the jail. There were only 2 cells, one empty, one occupied. Eli sat on the narrow cot, his back against the wall, staring at nothing. He looked up when he heard her footsteps, and something flickered across his face. Surprise, then pain. Clara, you shouldn't. I brought you breakfast. She set the basket on the floor by the bars, and Eli stared at it like he didn't understand what it was. I'm not hungry, he said quietly. You need to eat. Clara, please. Something in her voice made him move. He slid off the cot, crossed to the bars, and knelt down. His hands reached through, careful not to touch hers, and pulled the basket closer. He took the bread first, tore off a piece, and ate it slowly, mechanically, like he'd forgotten how. Clara watched him, her throat tight. They're sending me to Copper Ridge, Eli said after a moment. Trial's in 2 weeks. Dawson says I'll probably get 10 years if I'm lucky, 20 if I'm not. That's not right. It's the law. The law is wrong. Eli looked up at her, and in the pale morning light, his eyes looked older than they had yesterday. You should go, Clara, before people start talking. They're already talking. Then you should go before it gets worse. Clara shook her head. I'm not leaving you. You have to. No, I don't. Eli set the bread down, his hands trembling. Clara, listen to me. When people find out you helped me, when they find out you knew and didn't say anything, they're going to turn on you. They're going to make your life hell. You can't. I don't care what they do. I do. His voice cracked. I care. You've given me more than I deserve, more than anyone's ever given me. I can't let you throw your life away for mine. Clara knelt down so they were eye to eye, the iron bars between them like a wound that wouldn't heal. You listen to me, Eli Ward. You are not throwing anything away. You tried to help people who couldn't help themselves. You did something brave and good, and you've been punished for it ever since. That's not justice. That's cruelty. The bank doesn't see it that way. Then the bank is wrong. And I'm going to prove it. Eli's eyes widened. What? I'm going to Copper Ridge. I'm going to find out exactly what happened, and I'm going to testify at your trial. Clara, no. You can't stop me. They'll destroy you. Let them try. Eli reached through the bars, grabbed her hand before she could pull away. His grip was desperate, his palm rough and warm against hers. Please, he whispered. Please don't do this. Clara held his gaze steady and sure. You would do it for me. Eli's face crumpled. That's different. No, it's not. They stayed like that, hands clasped through iron, until Dawson cleared his throat from the doorway. Time's up, Clara. Clara squeezed Eli's hand once more, then let go. She stood, picked up the empty basket, and walked toward the door without looking back. If she looked back, she'd break. And she couldn't afford to break, not yet. Clara, Eli called after her. She stopped but didn't turn. Thank you? Clara nodded, swallowed the lump in her throat, and stepped out into the cold morning air. By noon, the damage had begun. Clara opened the diner at the usual time, but the regulars didn't come. Earl didn't show up for his eggs and bacon. Betty didn't come for coffee and gossip. Tom Miller didn't stumble in smelling like whiskey and bad decisions. The table stayed empty. The register stayed silent. At 2 o'clock, someone threw a rock through the front window. Clara heard the crash, saw the glass scatter across the floor like stars falling, and stood there staring at it. She didn't cry, didn't shout, just grabbed the broom and started sweeping. By 3 o'clock, someone had painted the word traitor across the side of the building in red paint that dripped like blood. Clara stood in the parking lot, arms crossed, staring at it. A few people walked by, neighbors she'd known her whole life, and they looked at the word, looked at her, and kept walking. Nobody helped. Nobody spoke. By 5 o'clock, the diner was still empty, and Clara knew it wouldn't fill again. She locked the door, hung the closed sign, and sat at the counter in the gathering darkness. The broken window let in cold air that smelled like autumn and endings. She could hear the wind picking up outside, rattling the sign, carrying whispers she didn't need to hear to understand. She'd made her choice, and it was going to cost her everything. That night, Clara counted her savings. $347. It was everything she had. Every tip, every spare coin, every dollar she'd saved for emergencies. It wasn't enough to fix the window, wasn't enough to repaint the wall, wasn't enough to survive if the diner stayed closed, but it was enough to get to Copper Ridge. She packed a bag, 2 dresses, a coat, a photograph of her mother, and went to bed without eating. Sleep came in fragments, broken by the sound of wind and distant voices and the memory of Eli's hand in hers. When she woke before dawn, her decision was made. The stagecoach to Copper Ridge left at 8. Clara was at the station by 7, her bag in one hand, her savings in the other. The ticket agent looked at her like she was a stranger, and maybe she was now. Maybe everyone in this town was a stranger after yesterday. One way or round trip? The agent asked. Round trip, Clara said, even though she didn't know if that was true. The ride took 2 days. Clara shared the coach with a traveling salesman, an elderly couple, and a woman with a baby who cried the entire way. They didn't talk much. Clara was grateful for that. She sat by the window watching the landscape change, desert giving way to scrub grass giving way to rocky hills, hills giving way to the mining town of Copper Ridge, perched on the side of a mountain like a scar that wouldn't heal. The town was bigger than Millersville but uglier. The buildings were cramped and crooked, leaning against each other like drunks at closing time. The The streets were mud and horse manure, and the air smelled like coal smoke and desperation. Men moved in packs, their faces hard, their eyes hollow. This was a place where people came to get rich or die trying, and most of them did the latter. Clara found a boarding house on the edge of town, cheap, dirty, but safe enough, and paid for 3 nights. The landlady looked her up and down with suspicion but took her money without questions. That evening, Clara walked to the bank. First National Bank of Copper Ridge was a squat brick building with barred windows and a door that looked like it could survive a siege. Clara stood across the street, studying it, trying to imagine Eli walking through that door with a gun in his hand and justice in his heart. She couldn't. The man she knew didn't fit that image. But maybe that was the point. Maybe the man she knew wasn't the man he used to be. Clara crossed the street, climbed the steps, and pushed open the door. The interior was cold and institutional. Marble floors, high ceilings, the smell of ink and old money. A clerk sat behind a cage, counting coins with mechanical precision. He looked up when Clara approached, his expression bored. "Help you? I need to speak to the manager." "What about? It's personal." The clerk sighed, set down his coins, and disappeared through a door behind him. A moment later, an older man emerged, balding, bespectacled, wearing a suit that cost more than everything Clara owned. "I'm Mr. Heatherstone. How can I assist you? I'm here about Eli Ward." Heatherstone's expression hardened. "What about him? I need to know what happened. The truth. The truth is he robbed my bank. He returned money to miners you refused to pay." Heatherstone's eyes narrowed. "Who are you? Someone who knows him. Someone who knows he's not a thief. Then you don't know him as well as you think." Heatherstone turned to leave. "Wait." Clara stepped forward. "Please, just tell me what happened. I'm not here to accuse you. I just want to understand." Heatherstone studied her for a long moment, and Clara saw calculation in his eyes, weighing risk, weighing reward, weighing how much truth he could afford to tell. "The miners had a claim," he said finally. "It was disputed. They didn't have proper documentation. We couldn't release funds without it. But they did have documentation. Eli saw it. Then Eli saw wrong. Or you lied." Heatherstone's face flushed red. "Get out. Not until you tell me the truth." "I said get out." "You cheated them," Clara said, her voice rising. "You cheated men who broke their backs for you, and when Eli tried to make it right, you branded him a criminal." Heatherstone stepped closer, his voice low and dangerous. "Listen to me very carefully. That man stole $15,000 from this bank. I don't care what his reasons were. I don't care what story he told you. He's a thief, and he's going to prison. And if you keep asking questions, you'll join him." Clara held his gaze, refusing to flinch. "Then I guess I'll see you at the trial." She turned and walked out, her heart pounding, her hands shaking with rage and fear and something that felt almost like hope. Because now she knew Heatherstone was lying, and liars could be broken. Clara spent the next 3 days digging. She talked to miners in the saloons, asking about the claim, about the money, about what really happened. Most of them were too afraid to talk. Heatherstone owned half the businesses in town, and crossing him meant losing work. But a few spoke quietly, in corners where nobody could hear, and they told her the truth. The claim was legitimate. The miners had the paperwork. But Heatherstone wanted the land for himself, so he refused to pay, knowing the miners couldn't afford to fight him in court. They would have lost everything if Eli hadn't stepped in. Clara wrote it all down, every name, every detail, every piece of evidence she could find. On the 4th day, she went to the courthouse. The building was imposing, stone and iron, built to intimidate. But Clara walked in with her head high. She found the clerk's office, requested to speak to the prosecutor, and waited for 2 hours before he finally saw her. The prosecutor was young, ambitious, with slicked back hair and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Hensley, is it?" "Yes. I understand you want to testify on behalf of Eli Ward." "I do. And what exactly do you plan to say?" Clara told him everything. The miners, the claim, Heatherstone's lies. The prosecutor listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "That's a compelling story, Miss Hensley. But without evidence, it's just a story. I have testimony, names, people who'll corroborate, people who are afraid of Heatherstone, people who won't testify under oath." He leaned forward. "Look, I admire your loyalty, but the facts are simple. Ward took money that didn't belong to him. That's robbery. It doesn't matter why he did it. So you're saying justice doesn't matter. Only the law. I'm saying the law is what we have. And if we start making exceptions, we don't have anything at all. Clara stood, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. Then the law is broken. Maybe, but it's all we've got. Clara left the courthouse, her hope fracturing, but not broken. If the prosecutor wouldn't listen, she'd find someone who would. A judge, a lawyer, someone. But as she walked back through the muddy streets of Copper Ridge, she realized something. She was alone in this fight. And alone might not be enough. The trial was held in a room that smelled like sweat and old wood. Clara sat in the back, her hands clenched in her lap, watching as they brought Eli in. He was thinner now, pale, his hands shackled in front of him. He didn't look at the crowd, didn't look for her, just kept his eyes on the floor, like he'd already accepted his fate. The prosecutor presented his case, testimony from Heatherstone, bank records, witness statements. It was efficient, clinical, devastating. Then Clara was called to the stand. She walked to the front of the room, feeling every eye on her, and placed her hand on the Bible. The oath felt like a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. State your name for the record. Clara Marie Hensley. And how do you know? The defendant. He worked for me, in my diner. And did he tell you about the robbery? He told me he returned stolen wages to minors who'd been cheated. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. The prosecutor stepped closer. So he admitted to taking the money. He admitted to doing what was right. That's not for him to decide, Miss Hensley. Or you. Then who decides? Men like Heatherstone who cheat workers and hide behind the law? The judge banged his gavel. Miss Hensley, answer the questions asked. Clara took a breath, steadied herself. Eli Ward is not a thief. He's a good man who tried to help people nobody else would help. And if that's a crime, then this whole system is guilty. The prosecutor smiled thinly. Are you finished? No. Clara looked at Eli, and this time he looked back. He deserves better than this. He deserves justice, real justice. Not this. The room fell silent. The judge leaned forward. Miss Hensley, your testimony is noted. But sentiment doesn't change facts. The defendant took money that wasn't his. The law is clear. The law is wrong. The gavel came down hard. That's enough. You're dismissed. Clara stepped down, her legs shaking, and returned to her seat. She'd said everything she could, given everything she had, and she knew it wasn't enough. The verdict came quickly. Guilty. The judge sentenced Eli to 15 years hard labor, with possibility of parole after 10. Clara watched as they led him away, his head still down, his shoulders bent, and she felt something inside her crack open, a grief so deep she couldn't breathe around it. She'd tried, she'd risked everything, and she'd failed. That night, Clara sat in her boarding house room staring at the wall and realized she had nothing left. Her savings were gone, her reputation was destroyed. The diner was probably vandalized beyond repair. She'd lost everything for a man who was going to spend the next decade behind bars. But when she closed her eyes, she didn't regret it, because at least Eli knew that someone believed him, knew that someone cared, knew that he wasn't alone, and in the end, maybe that was all anyone could ask for. And yet, as the cell door closed, Eli smiled faintly. For the first time, someone had called him good. The days after the trial moved like lead. Clara returned to Millersville with empty pockets and a hollow chest, watching the landscape blur past the stagecoach window, the same rocks, the same dust, the same endless sky that promised nothing and delivered less. The elderly couple who'd ridden with her before weren't there this time. Just a rancher who smelled like cattle and a woman who knitted in silence, their needles clicking like a clock, counting down to something Clara couldn't name. When the coach rolled into Millersville, the sun was setting low and red, painting everything the color of old blood. Clara stepped onto the gravel with her bag in hand and looked at her town like she was seeing it for the first time, or maybe the last. The diner stood exactly as she'd left it, broken window covered with boards, the word traitor still bleeding down the side in red paint that had faded but not disappeared. The door hung crooked on its hinges. Trash had blown into the corners of the parking lot, collecting like memories nobody wanted to keep. Clara walked up the steps, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The smell hit her first. Rot and mildew, and something sour that came from leaving food too long in the heat. The pie case was empty, the counter coated in dust. Someone had been inside. Chairs were overturned, salt shakers smashed on the floor, the register pried open and emptied of the few dollars she'd left behind. She set her bag down carefully, walked to the center of the room, and looked at the ruins of everything she'd built. Then she rolled up her sleeves and started cleaning. It took 3 days to make the diner livable again. Clara scrubbed the floors on her hands and knees, washed the windows until her arms ached, repaired what could be repaired, and threw out what couldn't. She painted over the word on the outside wall, 3 coats, because the red kept bleeding through like a wound that wouldn't close. Nobody came to help. She saw people pass by, Earl, Betty, Tom, others whose names she'd known her whole life, and they'd glance at the diner, glance at her, and keep walking. Some looked ashamed. Most looked satisfied, like they'd decided she'd gotten what she deserved. Clara didn't call out to them, didn't beg for forgiveness or understanding. She just kept working. On the 4th day, she reopened. She turned on the lights, flipped the sign to open, and stood behind the counter with a fresh pot of coffee and a hope so fragile it felt like holding smoke. Nobody came. Not that day, not the next. By the end of the week, Clara's savings were gone. The bank sent a letter about missed payments. The supply company refused to deliver until her account was settled. She was 2 weeks from losing everything, and there was nothing left to sell. She sat at the counter that night, alone in the yellow light, and let herself cry for the first time since the trial. Not for herself, for Eli. For the way his face had looked when they'd sentenced him. For the way he'd smiled at her, small and broken, when she'd called him good. For the years he'd spent in a cell, paying for the crime of having a conscience. Clara pressed her palms against her eyes and tried to remember what hope felt like. She couldn't. But somewhere, 300 miles away, in a prison yard where the sun beat down like punishment and the days blurred into one long stretch of gray, Eli Ward was learning to stand again. The prison was called Stonehill, and it earned its name, perched on the side of a mountain, surrounded by walls 20 feet high and guards who'd learned to stop seeing inmates as people. It was a place designed to break men down to nothing and leave them there. Eli arrived in chains, processed like cattle, stripped of his name and given a number instead, prisoner 40817. They shaved his head, gave him clothes that didn't fit, and assigned him to the quarry. The work was brutal. 10 hours a day, Eli swung a pickaxe into stone, breaking rocks into smaller rocks that would be broken into smaller rocks still. His hands blistered, then bled, then calloused over until they didn't feel like his hands anymore. His back ached. His shoulders burned. Every night he collapsed onto a thin mattress in a cell he shared with 3 other men, too exhausted to dream. But he didn't break. The guards expected him to. They always did. New prisoners either bent or shattered, and the guards had bets on which way Eli would go. But Eli had spent 8 months running, and he was tired of being bent by other people's expectations. So he stood straight, did his work, kept his head down and his eyes forward. And at night, when the other prisoners traded stories of the crimes that had landed them there, murders, thefts, betrayals told like badges of honor, Eli stayed quiet. "What about you?" a man named Dutch asked one night, leaning against the bars of their shared cell. "What'd you do to get 15 years? "Took something that wasn't mine," Eli said. "What'd you take?" "Money? How much?" "15,000? Dutch whistled low. "And you got caught? You must be stupid." Eli didn't respond. "What'd you do with it?" another prisoner asked. "Hide it somewhere? Bury it?" "Gave it away." The cell went silent. "You what?" Dutch stared at him like he'd spoken a foreign language. "Gave it to the people it belonged to. And you ended up here anyway?" "Yeah." Dutch shook his head, laughing bitterly. "Then you're dumber than I thought." But Eli didn't feel dumb. For the first time in a long time, sitting in that cold cell with men who'd killed and stolen and lied for their own gain, Eli felt something close to pride. He'd done the right thing, and Clara had believed him. That was worth 15 years. Months passed like water through stone, slow, relentless, wearing everything down. Winter came to Stonehill and the quarry froze over, making the work even harder. Men got sick, some died, the guards didn't care. There were always more prisoners to take their place. But Eli survived. He kept his head down, did his work, and in the evenings, when the guards allowed it, he wrote letters. Most of them were to Clara. He didn't know if she'd receive them, didn't know if she'd read them. But he wrote anyway, filling page after page with words he'd never been able to say out loud. "Dear Clara, I don't know if you'll get this. I don't know if you want to, but I needed to write it anyway. I'm sorry. For the trouble I caused. For the lies I told. For letting you believe I was something better than I was. You deserved the truth, and I gave you silence. That was wrong. But I need you to know something. The weeks I spent in your diner were the best weeks of my life. You gave me something I didn't think I'd ever have again. A place to belong. A reason to wake up. A chance to be more than the worst thing I'd ever done. You called me good, and I don't know if that's true, but I'm going to try to be, for you, for the man you saw in me even when I couldn't see it myself. Thank you. For everything. Eli. He sent the letter and didn't expect a response, but 3 weeks later one came. The guard tossed it through the bars like it was trash, and Eli caught it with shaking hands. The envelope was wrinkled, stained with something that might have been coffee or mud, but Clara's handwriting was unmistakable, careful, deliberate, like every word mattered. Eli opened it slowly, afraid of what it might say. Dear Eli, your letter arrived yesterday. I've read it 6 times and I still don't know how to respond. You say you're sorry. You don't need to be. You didn't cause trouble. You revealed it. There's a difference. The diner's struggling. People don't come anymore. I'm behind on payments and the bank's threatening to foreclose. I should be angry at you for that, but I'm not, because what we had, those weeks when you were here, that was real. And real things are worth fighting for, even when the fight costs everything. You asked if I think you're good. I do. I don't just think it, I know it. Good men don't run toward danger to help strangers. Cowards do that for themselves. You did it for people who had nothing. That's not just good, Eli. That's brave. The world might not see it that way, but I do. Stay strong. This isn't over. Clara. Eli read the letter until the words blurred, until his hands stopped shaking, until he could breathe again without his chest feeling like it was caving in. She hadn't given up on him. And if she hadn't given up, then neither would he. Winter turned to spring, and something unexpected began to happen. The story spread. At first, it was just whispers between prisoners, the man who'd stolen to give back, the thief who wasn't really a thief. Then it reached the guards, who told their families. Then it reached the newspapers. A journalist from Copper Ridge came to interview Eli, asking about the robbery, the miners, the money. Eli told the truth, simple and plain, and the journalist wrote it down word for word. The article ran on the front page. The thief who gave IT back, one man's fight for justice behind bars. It spread like wildfire. Other newspapers picked it up. Letters started arriving at the prison. Some calling Eli a hero, others calling him a fool, but all of them acknowledging what the court had refused to see. The law had punished a man for doing what it should have done itself. The pressure mounted. Miners from Copper Ridge, the same men who'd been too afraid to testify, came forward with affidavits, swearing under oath that Heatherstone had cheated them. A lawyer in the capital, moved by the story, took Eli's case pro bono and filed an appeal. And in a small diner in Millersville, Clara read every article, saved every letter, and held on to hope like a rope pulling her out of the dark. By summer, the appeal reached the territorial court. Eli was brought back to Copper Ridge in chains, thinner than before, harder, but with something in his eyes that hadn't been there at the first trial. Resolve. This time, the courtroom was packed. Miners filled the benches. Journalists lined the walls. And in the front row, Clara sat with her hands folded in her lap, her chin high, her eyes never leaving Eli's face. The new lawyer presented the evidence, testimony, affidavits, bank records, that Heatherstone had tried to hide. He dismantled the original case piece by piece, exposing the lies, the corruption, the injustice that had sent an innocent man to prison. Heatherstone was called to the stand. Under oath, under pressure, under the weight of evidence he couldn't deny, he finally cracked. Yes, he admitted, his voice bitter. The miners had the paperwork, but the land was worth more than their wages. I made a business decision. A business decision, the lawyer repeated. So you stole from them. I withheld payment pending. You stole from them. And when Eli Ward tried to correct your theft, you had him arrested. Heatherstone's face flushed red. He broke the law. No, Mr. Heatherstone, you broke the law. He tried to fix it. The courtroom erupted. The judge banged his gavel, called for order, and when the room finally settled, he looked at Eli with something that might have been respect. Mr. Ward, this court owes you an apology. The original verdict was based on incomplete evidence and, it appears, fraudulent testimony. Your conviction is hereby overturned. You are free to go. The room exploded again. Cheers, shouts, the sound of justice finally, belatedly being served. But Eli didn't move. He just sat there staring at the judge like he didn't believe the words were real. Clara stood, tears streaming down her face, and their eyes met across the crowded room. Eli smiled, not the small broken smile from before, but something real, something whole. The guards unlocked his chains, and Eli stood, rubbing his wrists, feeling the weight lift for the first time in months. He was free. The next morning, Eli walked out of Copper Ridge with nothing but the clothes on his back and Clara's last letter folded in his pocket. He didn't know where he was going, didn't have a plan beyond putting one foot in front of the other and trusting that the road would take him somewhere worth being. But as he crested the hill and saw the valley spread out below him, golden and wide and full of light, he knew exactly where he needed to go. Home, back to Millersville, back to the diner, back to Clara. It took him 3 days to walk there, hitching rides when he could, sleeping under stars when he couldn't. His feet blistered, his body ached. But he didn't stop. When he finally reached the edge of town, the sun was setting, painting the valley in shades of amber and rose. He stood on the highway, looking at the diner in the distance, and felt something crack open in his chest. The closed sign hung in the window. The parking lot was empty, but the building was still standing. Eli walked slowly toward it, his heart pounding, and when he reached the door, he stopped, took a breath, knocked, nothing. He knocked again, harder this time, and heard movement inside. Footsteps, the scrape of a lock, the door opened, and there she was. Clara stood in the doorway, her hair pulled back, her face tired but beautiful, and when she saw him, her eyes went wide. "Eli?" "Hi," he said quietly. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Clara stepped forward, closed the distance between them, and threw her arms around him. Eli held her, buried his face in her hair, and let himself break. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." "Don't," Clara said, her voice thick with tears. "Don't you dare apologize. I cost you everything. You gave me everything." Eli pulled back, looked at her through blurred vision. "Clara, you showed me what it means to stand for something, to fight for something, to believe in something even when the whole world says you're wrong." Clara cupped his face in her hands. "You didn't cost me anything, Eli. You saved me." Eli closed his eyes, leaning into her touch, and felt the weight of the last year finally lift. "I don't have anything to give you," he said. "No money, no home, nothing." "I don't need anything," Clara said. "Just you." Eli opened his eyes, and this time, when he smiled, it reached all the way to his heart. "Then that's what you'll have." They stood there in the doorway, holding each other as the sun set and the valley turned dark, and for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, the world felt kind. And when the new sign was hung and the coffee began to pour again, he left behind one final gift, a check she'd never asked for. The work began at dawn. Eli started with the fence, the same fence he'd repaired months ago, now broken again by wind and neglect and the casual cruelty of people who'd decided Clara deserved punishment. He worked slowly, methodically, his hands remembering the rhythm even though his body had changed. Prison had made him leaner, harder, but it hadn't taken away the thing that mattered most, the knowledge of how to build. Clara watched from the window, coffee cup warming her hands, and felt something settle in her chest that hadn't been there in months. Not quite peace, not yet, but the foundation of it, the possibility. "You don't have to do all this," she called out through the open door. Eli looked up, hammer in hand, and smiled. "I know." It was the same answer he'd given before, the same quiet determination, and Clara realized that some things about Eli Ward would never change, no matter how many miles he walked or how many bars stood between them. He was a man who fixed things, and right now, what needed fixing was her world. By midday, the fence was whole again. By evening, Eli had patched the roof, replaced the broken boards on the steps, and rehung the door so it closed properly for the first time in months. He worked without stopping, without complaining, and when Clara brought him water, he drank it in long, grateful swallows and went right back to work. "Eli," she said finally, standing in the doorway as the sun sank low, "you need to rest. I'm fine. You're exhausted." "I've been exhausted for a year, Clara. This is the first time it's felt worth it." Clara's throat tightened. She set the water glass down and crossed the porch to stand beside him. Together they looked at what he'd accomplished. The fence standing straight, the roof no longer leaking, the steps solid beneath their feet. "Thank you," she said quietly. Eli shook his head. "Don't thank me yet. There's still a lot to do. I don't just mean the diner." Eli turned to look at her, and in the fading light his eyes were soft. "I know." They stood there as the sky turned from gold to pink to deep purple, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out to the gathering dark. The valley answered with silence, vast and forgiving, and Clara thought maybe, just maybe, they'd survived the worst of it. But the worst wasn't quite over yet. The next morning, Clara walked into town. She'd avoided it for weeks, staying close to the diner, ordering supplies by mail when she could afford them, living small and quiet in the ruins of her reputation. But she couldn't hide forever. The bank wanted payment, the suppliers wanted their money, and if she was going to rebuild, she needed to face the people who'd torn her down. She walked down Main Street with her head high, her shoulders back, and her heart hammering against her ribs. People stopped to stare. Betty Cross whispered something to the woman beside her. Tom Miller spat in the dirt as Clara passed. Earl just looked away, ashamed or indifferent. Clara couldn't tell which. She kept walking. The bank was at the end of the street, a brick building with iron bars on the windows and a door that felt heavier than it should. Clara pushed it open and stepped inside, breathing in the smell of paper and old money and decisions that had already been made. The manager, Mr. Talbot, looked up from his desk. His expression didn't change, but Clara saw the calculation in his eyes. "Miss Hensley, Mr. Talbot, I assume you're here about the loan." "I am." Talbot leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "You're 3 months behind. I've been patient, but patience has limits." "I know. I need an extension." "On what grounds?" "I'm reopening." "Business will pick up." Talbot's eyebrows rose. "Will it?" "I haven't seen anyone in your diner for months." "They'll come back." "Why would they?" Clara met his gaze. "Because they'll get hungry, and because grudges don't last forever." Talbot studied her for a long moment. "You helped a criminal, Miss Hensley." "People don't forget that he wasn't a criminal. The court overturned his conviction. After the damage was done, the only damage was to people's pride, mine included." Talbot sighed and pulled out a ledger. "I can give you 30 days. After that, if you haven't made a payment, the bank will foreclose. Those are the terms." Clara nodded. 30 days wasn't much, but it was something. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet. 30 days goes fast." Clara walked out of the bank with her heart heavy and her options narrowing. 30 days to save everything she'd built. 30 days to prove that standing for something, for someone, hadn't been a mistake. She didn't know if it was possible, but she was going to try. That evening, Eli painted the outside of the diner. He'd found old cans of white paint in the storage shed, probably left over from Clara's mother's time, and mixed them until they were usable. Then he climbed a ladder and started covering the red letters that still bled through the wall. "Traitor." Stroke by stroke, he erased it. Clara came out to watch, standing in the parking lot with her arms crossed, and felt tears prick her eyes. Not from sadness this time, from something else, something fiercer. Gratitude. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. Eli didn't stop painting. "Because you shouldn't have to look at that every day. It's not your responsibility." "Yes, it is, Eli." "Clara." He climbed down the ladder, set the brush aside, and turned to face her. "You lost everything because of me. Your business, your reputation, your savings. The least I can do is help you get it back. You don't owe me anything. I owe you everything." Clara shook her head. "That's not how this works." "Then how does it work?" Clara stepped closer, close enough to see the paint flecks on his shirt, the exhaustion in his eyes, the quiet determination that had carried him through prison and back again. "It works," she said softly. "Because we choose it. Not because of debt or obligation, but because we want to." Eli stared at her, and something shifted in his expression, something vulnerable and raw. "I want to," he said quietly. "I want to stay here, with you, if you'll let me." Clara's breath caught. "Eli, I know I don't have much to offer. I know I'm broken in ways I'm still figuring out, but I'm good at fixing things, and if you'll let me, I'd like to spend the rest of my life fixing this place. With you." Clara felt tears spill over, hot and fast, and she didn't try to stop them. "You're not broken, Eli. I feel broken. Then we'll fix each other." Eli smiled, small and real and full of something that looked like hope, and pulled her into his arms. They stood there in the fading light, holding each other while the paint dried, and the valley settled into night. And Clara thought maybe this was what redemption felt like. Not grand or dramatic. Just two people choosing each other, over and over, until the choice became a life. The next 3 weeks were a blur of work. Eli repaired everything he could. Tables, chairs, the old stove that had been temperamental for years. He cleaned the kitchen until it gleamed, fixed the wiring that had been shorting out, and even rebuilt the pie case from scratch when he realized the old one was beyond saving. Clara worked beside him, cooking, cleaning, preparing for customers who might not come. She baked pies until her hands cramped. Apple, cherry, pecan, every recipe her mother had taught her. She polished the counter, washed the windows, and hung a new sign above the door. Hensley's Diner, open. On the morning of the 30th day, the day the bank's deadline expired, Clara unlocked the door at dawn and waited. The diner was perfect. Clean, bright, smelling of fresh coffee and cinnamon. Everything was ready, except the customers. 6 o'clock came and went. 7, 8. The parking lot stayed empty. Clara stood behind the counter, watching the clock, feeling hope drain away with every passing minute. Eli sat at a booth, pretending to read a newspaper, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. At 9 o'clock, Clara heard the crunch of gravel. She looked up. A truck pulled into the parking lot, old and dusty, the kind every rancher in the valley drove. The driver climbed out slowly and Clara's heart stopped. Earl. He stood there for a moment, staring at the diner like he was deciding something. Then he walked to the door, pulled it open, and stepped inside. The bell chimed. Earl took off his hat, nodded to Clara, and sat at his usual booth. "Coffee," he said gruffly, "and eggs, same as always." Clara felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them away and grabbed the coffee pot. Her hands shook as she poured, but Earl didn't comment. Just took a sip, grunted his approval, and opened his newspaper. 10 minutes later, another truck arrived. Then another. By 10 o'clock, the diner was half full. Betty Cross came in, didn't apologize, but ordered pie and coffee and left a tip. Tom Miller showed up, still smelling like whiskey, and mumbled something that might have been good to see you. Others came too, people Clara had known her whole life, people who'd turned their backs when she needed them most. They didn't say they were sorry, but they came, and that was enough. By noon, every table was full, and Clara was scrambling to keep up with orders. Eli worked the register, poured coffee, cleared tables, and through it all, he smiled. Not the broken smile from before, but something whole and real. This was home, and home had forgiven them. That evening, after the last customer left and the diner finally fell quiet, Clara locked the door and leaned against it, exhausted and exhilarated. "We did it," she whispered. Eli walked over, wrapped his arms around her, and rested his chin on top of her head. "Yeah, we did." They stood there in the dim light, holding each other, and Clara felt the last piece of her broken heart slide back into place. 2 days later, Clara found the envelope. She came downstairs early, the way she always did, and noticed something on the counter that hadn't been there the night before. A plain white envelope, unsealed, with her name written on it in Eli's careful handwriting. She opened it slowly, her heart already racing. Inside was a bank check. Clara stared at it, her hands trembling. The amount was written in firm, clear numbers, $8,000. More than enough to pay off the bank, more than enough to restock the diner, fix what still needed fixing, and have something left over for the future. In the memo line, Eli had written, "For the woman who believed." The signature at the bottom was simple, Eli Franklin Ward. Clara sank onto a stool, the check clutched in her hands, and tried to understand. $8,000. Where had it come from? How? She found Eli outside, repairing the fence again, a section that had come loose in the wind. Eli. He turned, saw her face, and set down his tools. "Where did this come from?" Clara held up the check. Eli's jaw tightened. "It's yours." "That's not an answer. It's compensation." "From the bank. The court ordered Heatherstone to pay restitution for the miners' wages. When the money came through, they asked if I wanted my share. I said yes, and I'm giving it to you." Clara shook her head. "Eli, this is yours. You earned it. You went to prison for it, and you lost everything standing up for me. This is the least I can do. I don't want your money. Then don't think of it as my money. Think of it as payment for room and board, for coffee and pie, for giving me a place to come home to." Clara's voice broke. "You don't have to pay me for that. I know. Eli stepped closer, took her hands, check and all. But I want you to have this, to rebuild, to have a future that isn't weighed down by what I cost you. You didn't cost me anything. Then let me give you something. Clara looked down at the check, at Eli's signature, and felt something warm and fierce bloom in her chest. Okay, she whispered. Okay. Eli smiled, pulled her close and kissed her forehead. Thank you. Clara didn't cash the check. Not right away. Instead, she took it to the hardware store, had it framed behind glass, and hung it on the wall behind the counter where everyone could see it. Not because of the money, but because of what it represented. A man who'd given everything to make things right. A woman who'd risked everything to stand beside him. A love built not on grand gestures but on small acts of faith. Coffee poured, fences mended, words spoken when silence would have been easier. People noticed the check, asked about it. Clara told them the story, all of it, from the storm that brought Eli to the trial that freed him. She told them about the miners, the bank, the price of doing what was right when the world called it wrong. Some people listened and understood. Others didn't. But Clara didn't care anymore. She'd learned something in the long months of struggle and silence. You couldn't make people see what they weren't ready to see, but you could live your truth loud enough that eventually some of them would hear it, and that was enough. The months turned soft and golden again. Summer returned to the valley, bringing long days and warm nights and the smell of sage on the wind. The diner thrived, not like before but better, steadier, built on a foundation that couldn't be shaken by gossip or judgment. Eli stayed. He fixed things, poured coffee, learned to make Clara's mother's pie crust by feel. He slept in the small room above the diner, woke before dawn to start the coffee, and fell asleep most nights listening to the sound of Clara moving around downstairs, closing up for the night. They didn't talk about the future, they just lived it. One morning, Clara woke to find wildflowers on the counter again, the same bright yellow blooms Eli had picked months ago. She smiled, touched the petals gently, and looked out the window to see him standing by the fence, watching the sunrise. She walked outside, stood beside him, and slipped her hand into his. Eli looked at her, surprised, then smiled and squeezed gently. "What are you thinking about?" Clara asked. "How different everything looks in the light, different how, kinder." Clara leaned her head against his shoulder. "It is kinder. We made it that way." Eli nodded slowly. "Yeah, I guess we did." They stood there as the sun climbed higher, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber, and Clara thought about all the things they'd survived. Storms and silence, judgment and loss. The long, hard road from broken to whole. It hadn't been easy, it hadn't been fair, but it had been worth it. "Eli, yeah? I'm glad you stayed." Eli turned to look at her, and in his eyes Clara saw everything she needed to know. Love, gratitude, hope, all of it shining clear and true. "Me too," he said softly. In that moment, with the sun rising over the valley and the smell of coffee drifting through the open door, Clara knew they'd found what they'd been searching for all along. Not redemption, not forgiveness, but something simpler and infinitely more valuable. Home. Weeks turned into months, and life settled into a rhythm that felt almost like peace. The diner filled with regulars again. Not just Earl and Betty and Tom, but newcomers too. Travelers who'd heard about the place where a waitress had stood up for a stranger and a cowboy had given away everything to make things right. They came for the story, but they stayed for the coffee and the pie, and the way Clara smiled when she poured refills. Some of them asked to meet Eli. He'd shake their hands, answer their questions with quiet humility, and then excuse himself to fix whatever needed fixing. He didn't like the attention, didn't think he deserved it. But Clara would watch him work, steady, patient, present, and know better. One evening in late autumn, when the air turned cool and the leaves began to fall, a rider stopped at the diner. He was young, dusty from the road, with a letter in his hand addressed to Eli Ward. Clara took it, signed for it, and brought it to Eli in the kitchen. "For you," she said. Eli wiped his hands on his apron and opened it carefully. His eyes scanned the page, and Clara watched his expression shift. Surprise, then something softer. "What is it?" she asked. Eli looked up, and there were tears in his eyes. "It's from the miners, the ones I tried to help." "What does it say?" Eli handed her the letter, and Clara read it aloud. "Mr. Ward, we heard you got out, heard you're doing well. We wanted you to know we're doing well too. Got our wages, paid our debts. Some of us bought land, started families, built lives we didn't think we'd get to have. We know you paid a price for what you did, spent time in a cell that should have held the men who stole from us in the first place. We wish we'd been braver, wish we'd spoken up sooner. But we're speaking up now. We want you to know you saved us, and we won't forget it. Thank you. Signed, the Copper Ridge Mining Company, Local 47. Clara finished reading and looked up to find Eli crying openly now, his shoulders shaking, his face buried in his hands. She set the letter down and pulled him close, holding him while he finally let go of the weight he'd been carrying for so long. They remembered, he whispered. They remembered. Of course they did, Clara said softly. How could they forget? Eli pulled back, wiped his eyes, and smiled, the kind of smile that came from somewhere deep and true. I thought it didn't matter, he said. I thought I'd done it for nothing. It mattered, Clara said firmly. It will always matter. Eli nodded, took a shaky breath, and folded the letter carefully. He tucked it into his pocket, right next to the first letter Clara had ever sent him. Some things were too precious to let go. That night, after the diner closed, Clara and Eli sat on the porch steps and watched the stars come out. The valley was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt like forgiveness. The wind moved through the sage, carrying the scent of earth and rain that hadn't fallen yet, and somewhere in the distance, a train whistle called out to the dark. You ever think about leaving? Clara asked suddenly. Eli looked at her, surprised. Why? Do you want me to? No. God, no, I wonder sometimes if you feel trapped here. If you stayed because you thought you owed me. Eli was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the horizon. Then he spoke, slow and careful. I stayed because this is the first place that ever felt like home, not because of the building or the town, because of you. He turned to look at her. You saw me when I was invisible. You believed me when everyone else called me a liar. You stood beside me when it would have been easier to walk away. That's not a debt, Clara, that's love. Clara's breath caught. Eli, I love you, he said simply. I don't know when it happened. Maybe the first time you poured me coffee. Maybe the night you let me stay. Maybe somewhere in between. But it's true. And I'm not going anywhere unless you tell me to. Clara felt tears spill over, warm and fast, and she didn't try to stop them. I love you too. Eli smiled, wide and real and full of joy, and pulled her into his arms. They sat there under the stars, holding each other, and the valley stretched out around them like a promise that couldn't be broken, and in the window behind them, the framed check caught the light, a testament not to money or debt, but to mercy repaid. To two people who'd been lost and found each other. To a love built on coffee and kindness and the quiet courage to believe that goodness still existed in the world. The morning light came slow and golden. Clara woke early, the way she always did, and walked downstairs to find the diner already warm. Eli had started the coffee, set out the cups, and was standing by the window, watching the sun rise over the valley. She walked over and stood beside him, and he slipped his arm around her waist like it was the most natural thing in the world. Outside, the highway stretched empty and endless, waiting for the travelers who'd come seeking refuge from the long road home. Inside, the diner hummed with warmth and light and the promise of another day, another chance, another beginning. Clara looked at the framed check on the wall, at Eli's signature written in firm, steady ink, and thought about all the ways a person could be rich. Money helped, but it wasn't what mattered. What mattered was standing, here, in this moment, with a man who'd walked through fire and come out whole. What mattered was the coffee brewing, the pies cooling, the door ready to open for anyone who needed a place to rest. What mattered was the choice to keep going, even when the road was hard, especially then. Ready? Eli asked, glancing at the clock. Clara smiled, squeezed his hand, and nodded. Ready? Together, they walked to the door, flipped the sign to open, and stepped back as the first customer of the day pulled into the parking lot. The bell chimed, the coffee poured. Somewhere in the heart of the West, where the land was wide and the sky endless, two souls who'd once been lost found exactly what they'd been searching for. Not fortune, not fame, but something far more valuable, a place to call home, and each other. But in the hearts of those who remembered them, their story became the whisper that kindness was worth the cost.